And now we're going to move on to Daniel Granada. He's going to be talking about what is it that sexual appeals means for us. And so we're going to be focused on this issue now. He's a diocesan priest from Zaragoza in Spain. He studied at the Juan Pablo II Institute in the field of family studies. He's a professor of theology at the University of Navarre and also teacher of moral issues. He's combined his teaching and academic activity with his pastoral activity, as he's worked at several churches in his diocese, and he's also worked as the pastoral representative. He's been an academic professor and director of the Juan Pablo II Instituto, and now he's in charge of the family pastoral courses. He's now involved in Veritas Amoris, in the Veritas Amoris project, and he has several publications that are related to his research action in relation to virtues and quality actions, charity actions rather. And so now you have the floor. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for coming here this afternoon. Well, before anything else, please bear with me with the title of the presentation. Well, you can just imagine that I'm not only going to refer to sex appeal in this lecture. I've decided not to be an expert in this field. I decided not to do this for many years ago, but I'm going to focus on the finishing line. I'm going to be talking about the sexual surrender of the individual for the community of people. And I would also like to answer why we are asking this question permanently, that has to do with attraction, with desire, with sexual power. But in any case, we could use whatever term we want to define it, and why it is so powerful, because many times it makes us go mad. But of all the notes that we have in terms of this fundamental sexual impulse, let's say that what really surprises us most and what really confuses us too is how solid it is. In other words, it appears in our daily experience. And it's something that is very difficult to govern. It's very difficult to integrate in the totality of an individual's experience. So this is why it has produces tensions, excitement, anxiety, and surrender. Well, I can speak without the mask on. Good. Well, anyway, I would like to start off by pointing out what sex appeal is. So in the common definition, it's all about deploying sexual and sensorial features that form part of the sexual attractiveness of the person. It's the physical and sexual attractiveness, and this is what most of the literature also considers in the field of sexology and psychological dissemination, and in the entertainment and leisure literature, where this appears most. Okay, my starting point for all this is that this consideration of sex appeal was born from a cultural reduction and from reduction in its understanding, in how we understand sexuality. So this is Karol Wojtyla, in one of the books in which he referred to this subject, was somewhat reluctant when he referred to this Anglo-Saxon term in the philosophical discourse, because also for him it was far too limited, or perhaps exclusively limited, to the field of sexual arousal and sexuality. So this is why this issue of sex appeal, well, can't go very far if it's only going to include this self-sufficiency of sexual values. In other words, this independence of the values of sexual attraction. But I would like to focus, therefore, on the other part of this formula. In other words, what has to do with the expression that covers the more humane element. In other words, the appeal or the vocation and even the possibility of saying sexuality is a vocation. Well, certainly its vocation is not to satisfy your instincts. And I think it's a fact that, well, we cannot consider independently the sexual values of a person when they only focus on this sexual convenience, and something that we are interested in or close to, because it's not this appeal, it's not this eternal appeal of the blood, as poets put it, that can be found in a permanent and involuntary predisposition towards attracting other people. But perhaps, well, sexual appeal or sex appeal, isn't it an appeal for eternity? Through the wound that is produced by the flesh. And Octavio Paz, the writer and poet, a Mexican poet who died in the 80s, in his book he talks about, well, it's the double flame. It has to do with eros and with money. And he says what he explains is how this original flame, or this original fire, in other words, sexuality, produces the red flame of eroticism. And this produces another flame that is blue, and which has to do with love and eroticism. He calls it the double flame of life. So I think that it's this pure flame, the blue flame, the one that has to do with love, that has a much better combustion. In other words, it also has higher calorific power, and he says that this stems from personal union and from love. And this is what is based on the sexual instinct, and this is what gave him his inspiration and his target. I think that any young person wants to control this devouring fire, these devouring flames that sometimes burn or upset you or demotivate you, and youngsters want to achieve the perfect combustion, in other words, the blue flame of their sexuality, so that they can express through sexual vitality and through the language of the flesh the truth of wonderful love. As Carlo Wojtyla said, it's that hidden wish you have in sex appeal. There are many authors who, in the field of anthropology, and this is the speculative fundament of these elements that we'll be talking about over the next 3 days. Well, let's say that what they do is accept the unity of sexuality and love. In other words, it's physiopsychology and spirituality. So therefore, what they do is defend the depth of the appellation or the calling of the sexes, or the depth of the sexes. And this is a book that Dr. Lacalle referred to, and it was written by Fabrice Callaye. Sex appeal needs more than attraction, refers to more than attraction. Physical love is a personality phenomenon. And Carol Wojtyla, in this book on ethics, responsibility, and morality. So what this means is that the basic phenomenon of these human trends, in other words, a sexual impulse, belong to human actions, but this is not what defines that action. So it is true that man is not constrained by instinct or by libido, but it's true that instinct is something that instigates, because it's true that an impulse impels you or pushes you, impellere in Latin. So this is why there's this basic inclination, but this does not really determine any kind of personal selection. So we have to make it very clear from the very beginning that human sexuality has nothing to do in its essence with animal sexuality, although we do find basic similarities, of course. But in any case, we should say that these are structurally diverse because of the configuration that freedom can deliver. When our author, Wojtyla, when he proposed that we address the sexual experience in a different manner from an integral perspective and rejects only something that is empirical and physical in terms of sex appeal, what he does and what he proposes in his book is that we introduce that, we include it in the extensive framework of the person and love. So he divided his study into metaphysical analysis, where he spoke about the different levels of attraction. There are different levels of personal attraction, And he also refers to a psychological analysis, where he includes the different affective and emotional manifestations that are always connected to sexual attraction, and that's when he will only suggest an ethical reflection. So in this manner, it is possible to demonstrate how this phenomenon of attraction and sexual incitation is configured internally in a personal manner, and how it does not happen in the simple manner of natural convenience, unless we are subjecting it to a mutilation. And then, yes, in that case, you can believe that it's only a physical issue. I think that this first step is completely clear, because Wojtyla talks about sexual impulse beyond the biological frontiers, and he uses the title Existential Value of Sexuality, and with a global approach, much greater than sexual satisfaction, and even greater than procreation too, and which includes all the order of the goals of human beings, which make existence be a whole, something that is achieved and is fulfilling. And so I would like to draw two conclusions from this issue regarding sex appeal. And that is, first of all, there's no generic instinctive manner of calling somebody through sex. So it's not going to be just a physical or sexual attraction, because each person is attracted in a personal and individual manner, in an existential manner, as Wojtyla would point out, where the sexual values that produce this reaction, and which perhaps configure the first element of desire, are received together with other factors, in other words, with affective factors, or with intellectual or intuitive factors, and spiritual factors. So in this regard, any form of attraction is a personal attraction. It's an exclusively physical attraction means that there's an aggression against personal factors that are extremely important. And it also has to do with emotional evidence. So this is a mutilation that has consequences. It mutilates your sexual instinct. And here we have the second conclusion. Any personal attraction, all personal attractions have to be interpreted. Because when we feel attracted, we can interpret what is happening to us. Well, basically because of this rational structure in which we receive it, and which is never disconnected from pure sexual values. So we can say that when we deal, or when we treat the other person as an object, we can only do so after having emptied and forgotten about outstanding affective evidences. And that can be seen in very specific forms, like, for instance, when you feel shy, or when you have your doubts of conscience, or when you feel ashamed, or when, well, you have to be very delicate in the way you deal with people in any personal relationship, or when there's a certain degree of personal recognition. Well, these are things that we are not going to observe if we're going to ill-treat that person. So not accepting that complexity of experience is a reduction that I believe is offensive, and I think that it doesn't allow us to get things done personally, and it offers the quality of personal purity. But in a second, what I'd like to point out, and I'm not sure, yes, here it is, that this characteristic, this complex personal configuration in our sexual perception has not only been addressed by Catholic authors, but also by many other people. And I just wanted to show you another expert, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who has nothing to do with the anthropological universe of Wojtyla. But in any case, he also delivers this statement, and he was fully convinced that sexual perception, or that sex appeal that manifests this sexual perception, are much more in-depth issues than the empirical impulse. And I would only like to say that the perception of this author is a very complex phenomenon. In other words, our perception is not neutral, it's not objective, but rather we receive it within a certain context. And he would say, yes, we receive things and gaps between these things. So we connect the sensitive qualities, or these sexual values that could have an impact on our sensitivity, and we put this inside a personal context of prior experiences. Now, those contexts without which we wouldn't be able to develop perception. And then what we have is a sort of synopsis that generates a feeling feeling or things that have to do with data and experiences, with predispositions, with memories and with traditions. And Merleau-Ponty would even say that we also have to deal with lots of illusions and ghosts. But in other words, perceiving is like facing a data constellation where a meaning emerges. And as I say here, I say that sexual perception is not the inauguration of knowledge, but rather it's the end result. And well, this, when applied to the field of attraction and sexuality, can also be seen in the amplitude of sexual attraction, and it's perceived sexually in a complex manner according to the individual's context. So this is why it's completely contextual. So somebody in love is not going to have the same perception as somebody that is lustful, and it's not going to be the same thing in somebody that wants a personal and comfortable relationship compared to somebody that perceives that as a vocational call, or somebody who's previously separated dimensions of this experience ideologically. And this can also, you can also apply what Aristotle said. Well, according to how each person is sexually, that's how the sexual element would appear. So we're talking about the configuration of sexuality and its interpretation. Well, this is something that should allow us to, well, leave behind this pure mechanism of reaction and stimulus in which we've placed sexuality, so a merely physical consideration of sexuality that is so typical in this consumer society of ours. And now I'm moving on to the final part of my presentation, that with proposals, and sexuality is personalized, and sexuality can be filled with meaning from the very beginning, since it's perceived. Sex appeal, or as we pointed out before, sexual attraction, is intentional. It's symbolic. In other words, it has a meaning. It represents something. What it does, it refers through itself to something that is even greater than it, something greater than sex. Modern psychology and anthropology can also help us recover this integral experience of the individual, because the individual does not only react, but also receives this experience as an event that has to do with his own person, which is complex and open at the same time. Right, well, I think that this interpretation and this in-depth perception of sexual motivation is something that we have to learn about, and we have to learn how to recognize it too, so that we can appreciate the scope and the reality of our situation, so that we can focus on a suitable end result, which will be the virtuous outcome. But the specific issue of fertility that we're going to be talking about at this Congress venue is also included here, and it should be seen in that whole of the rich interpersonal and communicative experience. So we have to achieve this integral unity of our experience. And on the other hand, we should avoid incurring in these multiple reductions of the sexual experience, and not only focus on some partial functions. And then we'll discover that sexual attraction is the sign of something that is far superior, and we will then be entering into the dimension of truth. The truth of the body, we could talk about that, for instance, or we could refer to the truth of sex, or we could talk about the truth of its language, and finally, the truth of love. Because these are concepts that I think are very interesting as regards establishing a life configuration that makes sense. So this is the symbolic nature of sexuality. So what does sex appeal to? And I think that this sentence from Giddens, I think that it's something recurrent in our own experiences. I wanted to talk about sex, and I ended up talking about love. So what we have seen is that when Karol Wojtyla tried to describe sexual attraction, he himself introduced himself in the affective universe and in the grandiosity of sexual attraction. So the subject receives a person, and he feels attracted to that person, at least initially, but then shortly afterwards, his willingness recognizes that affective link or that affective connection and relates it to the individual. And this experience is the experience of feeling love and the presence of somebody that is loved. And in other words, we have now entered the diverse levels of the fundamental experience of personal love, because there will be well, there is going to be a presentation by Dr. Perez Soba, who will talk about this element of amorous affect, which I think is very interesting because sex produces this attraction towards somebody else in order to establish an intimate communion with that person. So the adequate response to this appeal, to this sexual call, is our personal surrender or surrendering ourselves completely to sexuality, because sometimes people don't reach that blue flame, and that's only a sign of the relationship, of the positive relationship. And that's how we are only on the surface, we remain on the surface of a tremendous experience. And we have this sentence from, well, this is another sentence from Karol Wojtyla, which I've always found very interesting in his literary work. There's a big difference between what you find on the surface and what is the mystery of love. And here we have the source of the drama, because many people that think that they have reached the seventh heaven of love, they've practically done absolutely nothing. They've hardly deflowered it. They believe for a couple of seconds because they believe that they have reached the limits of their existence, because they have revealed absolutely everything. But then on the other hand, nothing. There's nothing. Nothing remains. Because after this, there's nothing left. There's nothing left. And yes, well, basically, the desire, its main focus is not the pleasure that we achieve or that we obtain, but rather it's the reliable expression. Pleasure is a reliable expression of the true end result of desire, of the true fruit, and that is the desire of there being an intimate union with the person in the unity of flesh or through flesh. So in other words, there's an intimate appeal to desire, and it's all about a conjugal union, and we want is to welcome the other person in myself. So this then acquires a personal meaning, and it also provides you with a motive to move or to get something done. So there's a new aim, there's a new goal in the attraction of the person. So we want to unite to that other person, and we want to do so through the flesh, and we can reach where even life begins. So therefore, this experience produces or generates life. That is a life of communion or even a physical life. So as from this goal, it is possible to configure an excellent manner of doing things, which will be a donation and a carnal relationship full of affect and personal recognition, and that is open up to life as a sign of how good that relationship. So in other words, sex becomes a donation. So this will be the virtuous sexual action. In other words, the chaste conjugal action, where chaste doesn't mean that you're inhibited, but rather it's a full relationship, because it's all about donation and absolute acceptance, because sexual dynamism is enriched and it's integrated in an affective dynamism. So that is the personal configuration of sexuality and affect enrich the individual and make that person grow. Sexuality is therefore vulnerable, and it can also be configured properly. So it's a door that leads to the individual through affect, but it eventually touches the heart and the intimate fibers of the personal being, and it opens up the space and the symbolic value of life that even reaches out to the mystery of God. So this is the true amplitude of sex, that is the gift of yourself, of the self. So this refers to Dante's flame. Here we're talking about all the resources of nature. We're talking about the impetus of instinct, but it's so significant because it should also take the individual, even in the learning process, it should take the individual towards frustration and insatisfaction, because these are elements that you find along the path in which you discover the final goal of sexuality, but this means that they achieve their goal in the end. But perhaps it's not that easy to see in such a fragmented society. Well, that even the poor issue of sex appeal we kicked off with, what it was asking for, with its inextinguishable flame, was to, well, reveal a mystery that goes far beyond carnal ecstasies. But I think that this, for everybody, represents a very significant educational and social challenge. Thank you very much.